So we're going to kick it off with China. It feels both appropriate and I think timely to start with China, because I think we would both agree this is the most consequential issue that the country and maybe even the world faces, but it's also been in the news quite a lot.
It's the literal long game.
The literal long game. President Trump and President Xi met face-to-face for the first time since Trump came back to office. They had spoken on the phone. This has been a pretty chaotic and hard to follow area of policy. Lots of news about threats and tariffs. Sometimes Trump saying he'd go as high as 150% tariff on China. A lot of speculation going into this conversation about where it would or wouldn't lead. Maybe you should start us off and, I don't know, interested in how you see the outcome and how this all actually happened in practice.
How to try to bring a little bit of analytical order to this chaos.
Coherence.
Is the question. Well, let me just start by taking a step back. They met after months, as you said, of moves and counter moves, threats and counter threats. And to boil it down to its essence, basically, President Trump launched a trade war against China with a massive tariff. He threatened 145%. Then he threw on some other export controls and additional measures to squeeze China. And China, rather than backing down, came back hard. They imposed their own tariffs, and then they brought out the big gun, which was a cutoff of rare earth elements, rare earth magnets that are critical for everything from military uses to keeping car production going in the United States. So after a flurry of diplomacy back and forth, these two guys meet, and at the end of the day, what do they agree? To go back to where they started. The tariffs largely come off. A few of them remain on from the United States. The rare earth controls are suspended on the Chinese side, and we're essentially back to where we were this spring. So maybe one way of looking at it is no real harm, no real foul. But for me, I think China really gained two things out of this that it can pocket going forward. The first is China learned that President Trump will back down if he gets pushed back hard. And he did back down. He basically said, in order for you to take off the measures you imposed on us, I'm prepared to take off the lion's share of the tariffs I imposed on you. China also learned that President Trump is very sensitive to supply chain disruptions. So they learned they have a lot of leverage and they can use it to back us off. In a way, they got very good insight into the cards they hold and the cards we hold. And I think that that is going to serve them well as we go forward. And that, to me, is a real concern, looking at this from the point of view of wanting to see the United States succeed in this competition. The second thing, and I think this is a big piece of business, is that it looks like the United States has agreed to put a lid on further export controls and other national security measures that would protect America's most advanced technology. So in 2022, 2023, 2024, we were adding additional controls to keep the most advanced chips and the equipment that makes those chips from going to China. President Trump seems to have agreed to stop adding to that list. China has wanted these controls to be subject to negotiation from the start. We've always said they're not negotiable. This is national security. But Trump basically just said, yeah, they are negotiable, and essentially agreed not to tighten them any further. And I think this is a big get for China that is going to pay dividends for them as we go forward, unless the United States can find a way out of the box that it appears President Xi has put President Trump in. What do you see?
Yeah, I agree with all that. And, you know, the rare earth thing may be just worth pausing on for a minute, because it sounds pretty esoteric when it's laid out, although you described, I think, quite well the use cases and the implications of why this is so critical to U.S. industry and to our defense industry in particular. I mean, many of our defense articles need these inputs to be produced, and, you know, U.S. companies have stockpiles, but they're not infinite. And so if you can't actually acquire these things from China, I think we found out quite quickly some of our defense industry would grind to a halt. But the United States has been on notice about this problem for quite some time. And, you know, this implicates not just the Trump administration, but administrations from both parties, including two administrations that we worked in.
Just stepping back for a minute, as I watched the choreography of the Trump-Xi meeting and then thought about all those months of back and forth, and you remember the whole taco thing, which was the original, you know, Trump always chickens out, the original backing off that Trump did earlier this year. He's got a playbook, President Trump does, for those he perceives are weaker than him. But he is way less assured, way more tentative, and way more vulnerable when it comes to dealing with strong men like Xi and Putin. Thus far, these guys have had his number. And as an American, what I want is a president who is most effective in dealing with our principal competitors and adversaries. Instead, he's least effective dealing with these guys. And I think that's something we're going to have to watch. Maybe he finds his footing over time on the Ukraine file. Maybe he finds his footing in the China case. But he just has so much more confidence dealing with allies and pushing them around than he does dealing with strong men. And that's a dynamic that I think is coming at some strategic cost to the United States.
As problematic as all that is, it may be also worth pointing out this could have been worse. And there were, I think, some reasons to believe that in the run-up to the meeting, it might end up actually in a worse place than it did. There were some sort of dogs that didn't bark in the ultimate announcement, at least, of what happened. And actually, by the way, one important caveat is we may not know everything that was actually discussed and agreed at this point. So worth just putting a marker down that either through leaks or announcements down the road, there may be other things that we learn were actually part of these conversations. But at least two areas I think that we were worried about, and I think a lot of the world was worried about, that didn't end up being a part of this deal. One is, as you announced, the U.S., it seems like, agreed not to add to the levels of export controls that we've imposed on China, but they are not scaling back these export controls as far as we were concerned they might be, including with regard to the most advanced chips that are produced and designed by mostly American companies, including NVIDIA, which was lobbying quite hard to the Trump administration to basically open the floodgates. Let us sell any and all of this to China, get them hooked on our chips, let us dominate this market. That would be good for us. And Trump, in the days leading up to the meeting, did seem to say that he was considering that. That did not get announced. The most advanced NVIDIA chips still are controlled such that they can't be sold to China. And then the other thing is there was no significant announcement related to Taiwan. A lot of nervousness in Taiwan and among people who pay attention to Taiwan that Trump might alter the U.S. policy that has been in place for decades with regard to Taiwan, and in particular about this issue of whether and what the United States approach is to Taiwan pursuing independence.
There is no more bizarre policy than the one China policy, which is just riddled with contradictions. But one element of the one China policy is the United States says we do not support Taiwan independence. We do not support Taiwan independence. What the Chinese want us to say is we oppose Taiwan independence. Not we do not support, but we oppose. So a more full-throated opposition to Taiwan moving towards independence. Thus far, American administrations have not been prepared to do that. There's been a lot of speculation about whether President Trump would go ahead and say, sure, why not? I'll say that. As you point out, that was a dog that didn't bark. He didn't say that in this meeting. But as we look forward, there are two more meetings to come.
Yeah.
One in China, when President Trump goes there, as he's committed to do in the early part of next year.
He says April.
And then one in the United States when Xi Jinping comes for the G20, which I think will be at the Doral or one of Trump's country clubs in Florida. And so those are two big set-piece summits where Taiwan's definitely going to be on the agenda. And to your point, I think some of those NVIDIA chips are going to be on the agenda too. So I agree with you that those are two places to watch as we go forward. I'd add just one more, which is what happens with respect to the United States' approach to China buying Russian oil. In the run-up to this summit, President Trump's advisors tried to convince the Chinese to agree to substantial reductions in purchases of Russian oil, basically to squeeze Putin. And we'll talk about Ukraine next. In the meeting between President Trump and President Xi, it sounds like Ukraine was a major subject. So could there be any progress on this, or could the United States decide to impose some secondary sanctions on China for buying Russian oil? That's something else we'll have to watch.
The only other thing I'd point out, just because it's timely, is today, I believe, the Supreme Court of the United States is hearing oral arguments on a case involving the president's authority to actually impose these sorts of tariffs, not just on China, but the rest of the world under this law that is always called IEEPA, but stands for International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Just basically the president's ability to declare a national security emergency and impose consequences on other countries. There are many people who believe that act does not authorize tariffs as a tool for the president to use, and the Supreme Court has taken this up. So if they strip him of that authority, he can still impose tariffs, but he will have bigger hurdles and have to sort of start again. So that's going to play out over time.
You know, John, before we move off of this subject, I just wanted to make a couple of observations that seem a little bit more technical, but I think are kind of interesting. One is, a lot of times when you get a major agreement with another country, you put out a joint statement. You have a single document that both sides agree to that says, here's what country A is going to do, and here's what country B is going to do. That didn't happen in this case. Instead, you had the U.S. putting out a statement saying this is what we agreed and this is what China agreed. And you had China putting out a series of different statements saying what they agreed and what they didn't agree. And by the way, they don't entirely match up.
Correct.
There's a lot of areas of ambiguity and uncertainty. And as we've already seen over the last few months, those areas of ambiguity and uncertainty can end up being the cause of one side taking an action the other side thinks they had agreed not to take, and then we're back in an escalation cycle. So we have a trade truce right now. We have a meeting scheduled for next year, but the lack of total clarity about what exactly was agreed, that is something we're going to have to watch. And then the other thing is, did you notice that this meeting took place actually at an airbase in South Korea? It didn't take place at either President Trump or President Xi's hotel, which is how this would normally go at one of these big multilateral summits. My bet is both sides basically said, you come to my hotel. No, you come to my hotel. No, you come to my hotel. And finally, the Koreans stepped in and say, hey, we have an airbase for you. It's be neutral ground. You can both come here. But it's one of these things where, you know, little power moves, who's the host, who's the guest, end up taking on this kind of outsized importance, and probably as many hours were put into negotiating where this meeting was going to take place as into the actual terms of the trade truce between the two sides.
It is one of the stranger idiosyncrasies of diplomacy that sometimes the biggest arguments in the run-up to a meeting like this are not over the substance. They're over things like literally who is hosting the meeting, where it takes place, and for a phone call, things like which leader will get on the line first.
Right.
And this is all, you know, magnified tremendously with the Chinese, who are very conscious of this sort of thing, but it happens in all relationships. And so you can sometimes have these standoffs where literally neither side is willing to put their head of state onto the phone until they hear that the other head of state is on the phone. We saw this a number of times. So one of the strange challenges above and beyond all the very hard issues we just described in doing this head of state diplomacy.
Yeah, it reminds me of phone dynamics with girlfriends in high school or something like that. Hi all. If you never want to miss episodes of The Long Game,
make sure to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel and share the show with a friend.
Okay, we are going to go to the second item on our agenda for today, which is the continuing Russian aggression against Ukraine, the continuing Russian war, brutal war against Ukraine. And I think, you know, you and I, when we left government, which, by the way, was this year, okay, you and I were still actually in government this year. It seems like it was 3 years ago at this point, but I just wanted to remind you, myself, and our listeners and viewers of that basic fact. When we left, I think we both told our successors, and neither of whom are still in their jobs, that we thought this war was going to go on for a while because we thought Putin was not serious about engaging in diplomacy. The incoming team thought they could wrap this up fast. We were pretty confident, no, you're just going to run into a bit of a brick wall with the Russians. Okay, here we are now in November, and the war is still going on. So the question is an end closer now than it was back in January? And I think both of us are skeptical. Both of us see reasons to believe the war will go on for quite some time. But one of the things President Biden would ask us to do in these PDBs was lay out the range of scenarios. So I think what we should do now is just take a moment to do the positive case, the optimistic case for how a ceasefire might be closer than some think, and then the pessimistic case for why a ceasefire is a lot further off than maybe people think, and then talk it through.
You've gamely expressed willingness to do the optimistic case, which generally, when you're working on issues like this, you're more likely to be wrong. So appreciate that, and why don't you lay it out?
So the optimistic case for why the Ukraine war could come to a ceasefire, not to some comprehensive peace settlement, but to a ceasefire in the not-too-distant future. And I'm not even going to define exactly what the not-too-distant future is because everything's so unpredictable. First, Russia is stuck on the battlefield. They are making very, very little progress at massive and growing cost. The Ukrainians have gotten incredibly effective at defending with the use of these drones in abundance, huge numbers of them that basically stop the Russians from being able to move forward in any serious way. We're talking more than 1 million dead and wounded Russians. And the rate of casualties in 2025 is much greater than in 2024 because of the lethality of these drones, an issue you and I both worked on quite a bit when we were in government. Second, Ukraine is actually getting more weaponry and is able to produce its own weaponry to a much greater extent than before. So the questions we had at the beginning as to whether they would just run out of Schlitz because President Trump was going to cut them off, that hasn't come to pass. And in fact, it's really impressive, their own defense industrial base, how many of these drones they're able to produce. So President Putin has to see that Ukraine's not just about to run out of material to fight this war with. Third, the Russian economy is suffering more now than it was before. And these sanctions that President Trump has imposed on oil will put a dent. How big a dent depends on how much they're enforced and against whom, but definitely a dent. And Ukrainian strikes against Russian oil refineries are putting pressure on the price of refined products and oil inside Russia in a way that the Kremlin has to be feeling. And then finally, the Europeans have now talked seriously about taking the lion's share of the Russian sovereign assets that were seized and held in banks in Europe and giving them to Ukraine, which would give Ukraine a kitty, really, to be able to sustain its economy for some time to come and send a clear message to Putin, Ukraine's not going to run out of cash any more than it's going to run out of Schlitz. So you put all these together, and Putin's calculus that time is entirely on his side might start to feel a bit more wobbly. And then Putin may think, Trump really wants a ceasefire. He really wants it. So maybe I should go for a ceasefire and I can get paid for it through some concessions from the Americans. I think that's the story one has to tell to get to the point where, the Russians would come to the table looking for a ceasefire. I think it would involve them calculating that, they can't just keep this going forever. That Ukraine is building up its capacity for resilience and resistance, and that maybe Putin can extract something more from Trump because of how badly he wants the ceasefire. That's the best I can do. I think it's important to verbalize that case, and this is the kind of thing we would do in the Oval Office or the Situation Room, just so that we made sure that we weren't going to end up with blind spots. But now you're going to tell me why that's totally wrong, and in fact, this war is going to go on endlessly.
Honestly, I think that might be the most optimistic I've ever heard you about a hard topic. We're not in the best case scenario business. Candidly, we're much more in the worst case scenario business, and so I thought that was a credible and game effort to play the part of an optimist by Jake Sullivan, which I know is not typecast. So well done. Unfortunately, I think probably ultimately incorrect, and I'll maybe say a little bit about why. So first, I think it's worth just pointing out, to end this war, I think requires three things. Pressure on Russia, first and foremost. Second, support, primarily in this case, economic support for Ukraine. And third, and I think most consequentially, Ukraine has to actually be putting pressure on Russia on the battlefield. So you need those three elements, in my view, to end the war. So let's go through them. You did point out, and I think it's true, that the United States has taken important steps to increase pressure on Russia. Candidly, I wasn't sure the Trump administration would do even what they've done up till now, which was, again, the first big step they've taken, these sanctions on the two largest Russian oil companies. I think that was a good thing that they did. And by the way, our administration, started the process of sanctioning Russian oil companies back in January, which I think was also an important step. But what's been the result of all that up till now? Because as you say, I think this is only going to work. It's only going to increase pressure in a meaningful way on Russia if there is steady, day in, day out enforcement of these sanctions, looking for the shell companies that will help Russia avoid and exploit gaps in the system, pressuring diplomatically countries, in this case particularly China and India, who are the major buyers of Russian oil, to not allow their imports to creep back up, even if they take some steps initially. And The track record of the U.S. government overall on sanctions enforcement, I would say, is mixed. And the track record of this administration, in terms of putting pressure on Russia in particular, is almost non-existent up until this recent step. So I worry that while they have taken this important step, it is not ultimately going to lead to the effects they want. And the best evidence for that is the companies that we sanctioned back in January are still, my understanding is, exporting at roughly the same volumes and same levels through black markets and shadow fleets and shell companies as they were when we pressed the button on those sanctions. So doesn't bode particularly well for how effective this will be. That's one. Second, on economic support for Ukraine. You're right. The Europeans are, I think you used phrase something like making noise or leaning in the direction of, or maybe on
that was a little more positive.
A little more positive.
They're getting
fine.
serious about
getting
it.
serious about saying good things about finally using this incredible resource that exists in their financial system, which is on the order of $250 billion in Russian sovereign assets that have been immobilized, meaning Russia does not have access to them, but that have not been to the fullest extent possible, used to actually benefit Ukraine economically, fuel their industry, keep their society afloat. And we, in the end of our administration, were putting a lot of pressure on Europe to do this. There was a lot of resistance to it. We thought a few weeks ago that they were finally going to break this logjam. But at the very last second, one country in particular, Belgium, probably backed by some other countries more quietly that have concerns about this, sort of threw a flag, and they did not get a decision out of the European Council to take this step, not seize these assets, but make them available through a complicated loan scheme to Ukraine. So now this gets kicked to another meeting of the European Council in December. Again, I think a lot of people are anticipating that maybe that will be the time this decision finally gets made, and it very much should, and I very much hope it will. But the track record on this is not great. And if they don't take this step, it will be a big problem because the U.S. has dramatically scaled back our economic support for Ukraine. The Europeans are doing their part, but it's not going to be nearly enough to keep Ukraine afloat. And Russia is threatening, and this may be part of the psychology, to retaliate against European countries if they take this step by seizing what assets they have still in Russia. A lot of companies still have factories and assets on the books. And Russia has, I think, spooked the Europeans a bit by making this threat. So we'll see. If this does not happen, that would be, I think, the single most damaging step that could be taken with regard to the war. And then,
but by the way, Kick to Another Meeting should be the title of the book about how the Europeans get together to make decisions. I love them dearly, but there's a lot of process. There's a lot of process.
Highly, highly painful. Getting many countries to agree on one thing is much harder than a single country.
But you still see it as possible.
I think they will take this step. I do think they will take this step. But every month that goes by, Ukraine is under-resourced on the battlefield, and that's hard. And then finally, the battlefield. So this is the most important part of a war, obviously. It's worth noting, I think if you gave us a description of a day's events on the battlefield in Ukraine, but didn't tell us what date it came from, it would be very hard for us to take that description and match it to any particular time period over the last 18 months even. Basically, the situation has been more or less the same. Russia is making, as you said, slow, steady advances at enormous cost, and still the war is being fought in the eastern part of Ukraine, and still their cities, in this case, the one I'm thinking of is Bakrovsk, that we were thinking about being falling from Ukraine to Russia back when we were in office, and still has not fully and finally fell. So the situation is extremely static, but I think there is some reason to believe that the trend lines are actually moving against the Ukrainians. And I'll give you just a few examples of this. Yes, Ukraine has innovated in its drone industry, has closed the gap with Russia, which had many more munitions at the beginning of the war, by building hundreds of thousands of drones a month, maybe up to, at some point, 1 million drones a month, which is staggering, more than any other country in the world. And those are the weapons that are inflicting the most casualties on Russia. But the challenge is that winter is coming. We are heading into the coldest part of the calendar, and Russia has demonstrated over the last few years kind of a very dark track record of going after civilian infrastructure during the winter that punishes the Ukrainian population, making them unable, because the electrical grid gets attacked, to heat their homes, putting more pressure on the Ukrainian government to deliver. I mean, how much time did we spend strategizing about, working with the Ukrainians on, spending money on, hardening and improving the Ukrainian energy infrastructure to try to protect them from this, a lot of that work has not been happening. So this could be a very hard winter in Ukraine, assuming, which I think we all have to, that Russia will be going after those targets, pummeling them, day in, day out. Second, Russia is now closing this technical gap that you described. They are developing their own drone capabilities. They are developing very formidable electronic warfare and finding ways around Ukraine's electronic warfare such that Ukraine's drones are becoming less effective, Russia's drones are becoming more effective. I think this is still an advantage for Ukraine, but that advantage is eroding. And I think what we're all worried about is a breakthrough that actually leads not just to incremental Russian gains in the East, but bigger Russian gains. And as long as Russia thinks that's possible, even if it is paying an enormous cost, I think it's going to keep fighting. Ukrainian morale is not high. They have shortages of manpower, which we spent a lot of time talking to them about because they are not mobilizing their entire society. And while I think the most likely situation is 6 months from now, if we read a daily report about the war, it would look just like the report from today and just like the report a year ago. There is this lingering, nagging concern in the background that actually Russia could start taking significantly more territory.
By the way, I think this is a really important point. And, as I said at the outset, the president looks for all scenarios. And we've chiefly homed in on grinding stalemate versus ceasefire. But Russian breakthrough is a scenario, and it's one that has to be taken quite seriously. And I think if we were still sitting in our seats, we'd be thinking a lot about what could we do to widen that gap between the Russian and Ukrainian drone capabilities, to increase what the Ukrainians needed to ensure that there was no such breakthrough, and to increase both the military and economic pressure on Russia so that the costs to them just kept mounting. Neither of us touched on what I think is another factor here that is something that was very much on our minds when we were dealing with this issue, and that is, as Putin feels additional pressure, maybe that makes him back off. Maybe. There's no evidence that has happened so far, despite my game effort to lay out the optimistic case. But maybe he goes the opposite direction and escalates not just in Ukraine, where I think what he'll do this winter is even more extreme than he's done in previous winters in terms of going after the civilian population, but also increases hybrid warfare against the West. Hybrid warfare is basically a fancy way of saying sabotage and mayhem. Whether it's cyber attacks, or it's cutting undersea cables, or it's flying these drones around Poland or Denmark or other countries, or it's incendiary packages in warehouses that burn the warehouse down, even the possibility of assassinations. Putin's got a lot of levers to pull in terms of putting pressure on NATO countries, undermining their confidence, trying to sow some degree of division and lack of certainty and clarity about Article 5.
The way I think about this is my underlying assumption, I think you probably share it, is Russia does not want to go to war with NATO. They have demonstrated a remarkable degree of unwillingness to actually directly attack NATO during the course of this conflict, even though NATO countries, principally the United States, have provided Ukraine with the ability to inflict now more than 1 million casualties on Russia, without Russia responding, again, directly against NATO in a military sense. But as you say, I think their strategy is basically to impose as much cost and punishment on NATO for helping Ukraine as they can, below the threshold of something that will trigger NATO wanting to go to war with Russia. The problem is they don't know exactly where that line is, and I think NATO doesn't know exactly where that line is. So Russia is constantly probing and testing with cyber, with sabotage, with political interference, with all these tools they have to make life at least more complicated for the countries that are supporting Ukraine. And at some point, they're going to edge up to and maybe even stick their toe over that line, and then there will be a very consequential moment for NATO. Because at the end of the day, what an alliance is the willingness to actually take action to enforce that the alliance is real. Russia has not tested NATO yet to that extent, But I can imagine them being quite tempted, especially given the, let's just say, slightly ambivalent approach the United States in this administration has taken to NATO and to what's called Article 5, which is the commitment of all countries to treat an attack on one as an attack on all of them.
I mean, they've really edged up to the line. That swarm of drones in Poland, which the Poles are convinced was intentional. The U.S. has raised questions about that. My personal view is it was probably intentional, just looking at all the evidence. Or an armed fighter jet actually coming into NATO airspace.
12 minutes overflying Estonia.
I mean, now some NATO countries are saying that happens again, we shoot it down, and then you start thinking about the consequences and possibilities of that. So what happens in Ukraine has tended to stay in Ukraine so far, but is that going to be the case going forward? That remains open, and it doesn't require a full-on Russian frontal attack on NATO. It can be just more and more of this type of sabotage, mayhem, destabilizing activities that ends up adding up to real escalation, and that's something we're going to have to look at. Another factor here, we've really kind of homed in on the points of pressure and pain on the two sides. But, of course, one of the massive stumbling blocks to getting to a ceasefire or getting to an end to the war, certainly a just end to the war for Ukraine, has been this issue of security guarantees. It's been basically Vladimir Putin's view that he doesn't just want a neutral Ukraine, he wants a neutered Ukraine, a Ukraine that has caps on how much military capability it can have, and a Ukraine that is formally excluded from being in NATO, and that any guarantees that Ukraine gets on its security from the West somehow have to involve Russia, like, the fox gets to guard the hen house kind of thing. And he's stuck by that through thick and thin. I think there was a misunderstanding coming out of Anchorage as to what he meant by security guarantees, but a big part of it was, you can guarantee Ukraine's security as long as Russia's part of the guarantee, which is kind of you can see how from the Ukrainian perspective that is completely unacceptable. So I don't see Russia moving off that. Ukraine can't accept that, and that's pretty fundamental. That's why I think President Trump has moved back from let's just go for an end to the war full on to, hey, can we just get a ceasefire and then negotiate all of that later? But I don't know how you see that question playing into things right now.
Well, look, I think the best thing that's happened, honestly, in the last 10 months or so of this administration on this issue is that President Trump does seem to have realized now that the barrier to either a ceasefire or an end to the war is actually not Ukraine, which I think he came in believing to be the case, but is Russia. He came in believing that Ukraine was stubbornly refusing to do a deal. So if he put enough pressure on Ukraine, they would agree. And then, of course, he and his, I don't want to say friend, but kind of the way he thinks about Vladimir Putin is as a friend, could work out an arrangement to end the war. And now he doesn't seem to believe that anymore. He's been, I think, disappointed many times by Russia's unwillingness to say yes. And Ukraine, I think quite wisely, even though I'm not sure they want it, has said yes to each of Trump's proposals. So that is a good thing. But the problem is Russia's position is there are two big issues in ending the war. One is, as you say, security guarantees, basically the future alignment of Ukraine. Are they part of NATO or not? Do they have promises from Western countries about support or direct assistance going forward or not? And then territory, which is like, what are the lines on the battlefield? And Russia's position right now, which, as you say, has not changed, is Ukraine has to be neutral/neutered going forward, no NATO and no significant assistance from the West, and Russia wants more territory than they have already gotten on the battlefield. So it's not really a negotiating position. It's a demand for more things than they have been able to win militarily
for
on the
Ukraine
battlefield.
To actually withdraw from territory
they now control.
That is their sovereign territory, and hand it over to Russia.
So the notion that they're going to give that away at the negotiating table when Russia can't take it on the battlefield, I think, makes this pretty far-fetched in terms of resolution anytime soon. And to Trump's credit, he is not pressuring now Ukraine, at least today, to give away either of those things for a near-term ceasefire.
Because the reporting coming out of the Zelensky meeting in Washington not too long ago was that President Trump actually pushed him to give up the rest of the Donbass, including the areas that Ukraine controls. So he backed off of that, but
He'll go back. The part of the challenge is the U.S. position is quite hard to pin down. One minute he is saying, as you say, Ukraine should give up territory to help get a deal. The next minute he's saying, just freeze the lines where they are. And by the way, 2 months earlier, he was saying Ukraine could win back all their territory. He actually put that out in a statement around the UN General Assembly in September. So kind of hard to know where he will be from week to week.
I think we've now piled skepticism upon skepticism on the war ending.
You've come gradually over to my side.
But I will say the reason why I think it's so important to run this exercise is, would you be completely shocked, like utterly flabbergasted, knock you over, if a month from now somehow, Putin had concocted some new way of going at things and agreed to some ceasefire because Trump's made a series of concessions to him? I would not be bowled over by that. It doesn't seem like the likely outcome for all the reasons that we've laid out, but thinking about that possibility is an important part of assessing the state of play here, and that's the kind of thing that we need to keep doing.
So I think if you look around the world at what have been the biggest changes in terms of strategy, in terms of emphasis, in terms of focus in the Trump administration, you'd have to say that the approach to our own hemisphere is at or close to the top of that list. We've had a massive U.S. military buildup in the Caribbean, of all places. We have had, I think, as of today, 16 U.S. military strikes against civilian drug trafficking targets, or at least alleged drug trafficking targets that have killed more than 60 people in the Caribbean and in the Eastern Pacific Ocean. And you have the administration saying that as a matter of its own strategy and priorities, the Western Hemisphere and these drug cartels, which, in fairness to the Trump administration, are responsible for the deaths of many Americans every year. Fentanyl alone on the order of tens of thousands of U.S. deaths, that is the top of the list of U.S. security concerns and military concerns. The U.S. is producing a defense strategy that has not yet been published, but the kind of early reports about what it will say is that not Russia, not China, but our own hemisphere and these drug cartels are going to be at the top of the list of U.S. threats and concerns. So I think one question that maybe you can start on is if that is your underlying position and assumption, how would you go about preparing to implement that strategy? And then we can talk maybe about how wise it is or not. Well,
this is the challenge that I see in what's unfolding right now off the coast of Venezuela. What is the objective? What is it? What's the stated objective? It is to disrupt the flow of drugs coming from Venezuela and parts beyond in South America to the United States. That's the stated position. But lurking in the background is this idea that actually the objective may be to get rid of Maduro, and in doing so, usher in a new dawn in the hemisphere of U.S.-aligned leaders in the major countries. Basically get a Javier Milei for Venezuela. So,
do you want to say who Javier Milei is, just in case?
Oh, good point.
100% of people listening?
He is the president of Argentina, who was the recipient of a massive gift from the United States Treasury to the tune, I think, of $20 billion. Line of credit, basically, to be able to stabilize his economy because he is basically a darling of the White House. They see him as in the MAGA mold, basically. So if you're trying to run a tabletop where you say, how do we take our strategy and execute it? You really always want to start with, what are we trying to achieve? And that's why I focus in on the difference between here, the stated objective and the seemingly underlying lurking implicit objective, because the gap between those two is really significant. If it really is just about disrupting drug supply and reducing the deaths of Americans, and by the way, we viewed drug deaths in the United States as absolutely a paramount national security issue and put a lot into trying to reduce those deaths. And in fact, fentanyl deaths in 2024 came down considerably, in no small part because of a whole of government effort, including a massive National Security Council effort. Our colleague Liz Sherwood-Randall playing a central role in that, going after it. But would you be moving an aircraft carrier into the Caribbean? Would you be moving fighter air wings and all manner of other military hardware that looks much more like the backbone of an invasion force than it looks like a counter-drug operation. This is why I have a lot of questions about what they are up to. So trying to get nailed down on objectives is important, because then the next question would be, what are your targets? Taking out a bunch of little drug boats at the end of the day, and in this case, we're at, as of today, I think 16 of these boats have been taken out and dozens of people have been killed. And we have no idea who those people are. There's been no legal process on this. The call to authority that the president has made, I think a lot of lawyers who we respect quite a lot have not just raised their eyebrows at that, they've shook their head pretty hard. So, but if you can't define your objectives clearly, and then your targets basically at this point are these one-off boats, where do things go from there? In my view, the laws of physics kind of say once you've moved all this hardware, once you've set this sort of objective of wanting to massively disrupt drug supply and potentially get rid of Maduro, it pretty inexorably leads you towards striking on land, which they've been flirting with but haven't actually done. So where do you think that goes? What would be, if you're sitting there as the Deputy National Security Advisor right now and the debate is unfolding, what's our next step? What's our next move here? What are the things that you surface as the key considerations?
Yeah, so I think we mentioned earlier in this conversation that we are sort of in the worst case scenario business, at least in terms of what you're preparing for. So I think one of the things you'd have to do is have a real conversation, whether or not you think this is, brilliant policy, about what are the things that could go wrong and how do you prepare for those so you can mitigate them if, God forbid, they happen. And I think there's a few things you'd want to prepare for here. So if you're actually thinking about taking military action on the ground in or in the skies above Venezuela, you'd have to worry about things like a U.S. plane being shot down, maybe that pilot even being apprehended by Venezuelan authorities, held as some sort of hostage or human shield to try to stop or at least lead to a negotiation to try to stop the U.S. military from its intervention. That's one scenario I'd be worried about. I think you'd be worried about the intervention failing, at least at the level of forces that the U.S. commits to it initially, and then you'd be faced with this big question of, well, do you stop there and take the L if you're the Trump administration, or do you escalate and actually put more U.S. forces at risk to try to achieve the outcome of regime change? And then I think even in the aftermath of a quote-unquote successful intervention that topples Maduro, the problems obviously don't end there. We've learned that in other parts of the world, principally Iraq, which is sometimes the initial intervention to produce regime change is the easy part, and then the aftermath is very complicated. So who is the successor to Maduro? And are we going to impose that on Venezuela or just allow that to play out? And either way, are we sure that that person will be better and not worse? I would also be worried about the Venezuelan population looking at this military intervention and the chaotic nature of the government that's likely to follow and saying, as they have been saying now for some years, let's get out of Venezuela and move into the rest of the hemisphere, including to the U.S. border. And there have been millions of Venezuelans who have already left that country, just given the very challenging environment there over the last decade even. So those are some of the things I'd worry about.
So, look, this is something where between this week and next week, something could change. Those are the three big issues we wanted to cover, but maybe not the most important, because the most important, of course, is the recent Netflix movie, House of Dynamite, which you and I have both watched. Maybe you want to situate the listeners. First, let's start with their spoiler alert. There will be moments in this portion of our conversation where we give away certain things that happen in the movie. So if you haven't seen it, go see it. Press pause right now and come back and listen to this after you've watched it.
A good warning. And I just want to start off by saying, maybe a little bit parochially, it is very rare, actually, if you're a person who works in the government who has the word deputy in your title, that you see your job portrayed on the big screen. Not something that's ever happened to me or that I ever would have expected. But in this movie, unfortunately, maybe for the character who had your job, who is out of the office with a medical procedure, with a colonoscopy, it is the Deputy National Security Advisor who becomes one of the principal characters, which I thought was great, except for a couple of aspects of how he's portrayed that maybe weren't super flattering. One is he's a bit of a chaotic, discombobulated character showing up late for work.
Never seen that before.
Never seen that before even once. He initially gets a phone call about the events that are unfolding on his cell phone as he's going through security, and he has trouble connecting. And then second, when he gets on the phone to actually try to talk to the president about what's happening, he introduces himself to the president of the United States, somebody who ostensibly he'd been working with for months, and says, Mr. President,
sir, we've met.
We've met, some months ago at the G8. So anyway, maybe not the way I would have preferred the job to be portrayed, but good, I think, to be on the screen at all.
Also, what's his name?
His name, sadly, is Jake, not John, which is just fine. But yeah, so a number of aspects about this. Maybe we should just describe, though, the scenario that he and the other characters in the movie face for those who have not seen the movie yet.
I would say just before we do that, the reason the National Security Advisor doesn't appear in the movie, though the name of the last National Security Advisor does appear in the movie, is because, as you said, he was undergoing a colonoscopy, something both you and I did when we were in our jobs in the last year. And so, brief PSA to folks over 45, go get your colonoscopy. You do go under, and for that period of time, you probably are not in good shape to actually handle a dramatic national security crisis, but it's really important for your health.
You managed to avoid any national security crises while
during
doing
that time. So what is the national security crisis in question here? A missile is launched by whom we don't know, from exactly where we don't know, because for some reason the sensors that would ordinarily pick that up have been disrupted or didn't function. So there is a nuclear-armed missile flying towards the continental United States, origin unknown, shooter unknown, and there are 18 minutes. That is the scenario that is set up, and the movie follows then what unfolds in the U.S. government to try to defend and then to consider responses to what happened. Is that a fair summary of the movie?
I think it is. And one interesting aspect of how they tell that story is they essentially tell it from a number of different perspectives, one being very much the kind of White House situation room and advisors to the president, another being the president himself, and maybe a third being the Defense Department and military side of this, which includes the people out at a relatively low-profile military base in Alaska who have the very unenviable job of having to try to shoot this missile out of the sky before it harms people in the United States. So that's the story. How do you feel they did at sort of describing and portraying what this might be like if it happened for real?
Well, look, there were a few little nitpicky things that they got wrong. Your character, the Deputy National Security Advisor, tells the president they met once at the G8. Of course, there is no G8. Russia got kicked out many years ago. It's the G7. These are small things. I also thought it was interesting that people were entering the Situation Room by walking through the White House press briefing room. I think they were taking some poetic license in that. We did not tend to make that a regular thing, especially not as a crisis was unfolding. Go mingle amidst the reporters as you head to the sit room. But the filmmakers actually came to us and asked for permission to come look at the Situation Room, to come actually see the physical space to understand the backdrop of this story they were going to be telling, and we granted them permission to do so, and they worked with our incredibly professional and capable Situation Room team to walk around and see it all. And I think that they captured that pretty darn well in the movie, and they captured a lot of those aspects extremely well. I would say one thing that really stood out to me watching it is that, everyone, whether you're working on an inbound nuclear missile or you're just, working in client services, has been on a Zoom call from hell. This is like the ultimate Zoom call from hell. People are on and off screen. They're dropping. People can't hear each other. There's a certain reality to just the chaotic and incredibly human nature of all of this, and I know you and I were discussing that before.
Well, look, in an ideal world, if something this consequential happens, everybody would be in the same place. You'd get together around a big table. you'd have a kind of quiet moment to discuss exactly what is going on and what the response should be. In this scenario, which is truly a nightmare, well, for one thing, you have 18 minutes before the missile ostensibly is going to hit the United States. Two, which is very realistic, people are scattered all over the place, including in some ways all over the world. And so trying to connect them, even through advanced technology, is always highly flawed. And so, that 18 minutes is probably reduced to like really a few good minutes of conversation given people in motion, and given in this scenario, which is also quite real, certain people are being pulled out of wherever they are and sent to a secure location in the side of a mountain somewhere, just in case there is another nuclear strike on the United States. So actually being able to have a reasonable conversation about this is challenging. I think that's well portrayed. But also, as you say, people are portrayed, I think, very correctly as like three-dimensional human beings who are doing their jobs in the most professional way they can, but also who have other personal considerations. Maybe somebody's a wife is expecting a child, which is the case for my character in the movie. Maybe somebody's going through some marital troubles. Maybe somebody's family is like in the line of fire for where the missile is expected to land. In this case, Chicago. And so you don't just stop being a human being who has these other extremely weighty considerations as you manage a crisis like this, which I found very accurate and realistic.
Okay. Hey.
Listen to me, get Liam. Get in the car and just start driving. Right?
Where? What are you talking about?
West. Go west as fast as you can. Get away from any urban centers you can
Liv,
get,
what
okay?
the fuck?
Listen
What's
to
going
me.
on there?
I'll call you. I love you. I love you. Can you kiss Liam for me? Just kiss him.
That's life. Those are the people. It's human all the way down. These are not robots or algorithms in this disembodied government. The U.S. government and the national security enterprise is just the sum total of the human beings who comprise it. And like you said, they are three-dimensional characters, not two-dimensional characters. And they don't just bring logic to the table, they bring emotion, and they bring stress. And we definitely see that over the course of the film. Now, you and I, of course, had to deal with the situation not nearly of this level of gravity, no nuclear missiles fired at America, but one that is certainly an analogy to what happened here. And this is when a missile of unidentified origin slammed into a farmhouse in Poland and killed 2 people. And the first thought was, that's the Russians attacking NATO territory.
This is actually a good example of people being in totally different places, totally different time zones, totally different parts of the world, but having to work together to puzzle through this. So I was sitting at my desk in the White House. It was early afternoon, and I got a phone call from a friend of ours, David Cohen, who's the deputy director of the CIA, saying, look, this thing just happened that actually could be quite significant. The polls are saying that a Russian missile has struck Polish territory and killed 2 people. Now, we're still trying to figure out exactly what happened, but initial reports are often, let's just say, revised over time. But right now, this looks quite consequential. And I remember thinking, man, like there are a few things that we have been quite concerned about happening and trying very hard to deter from happening. Russia using a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, and Russia attacking NATO, which could pull the United States directly into the war because of our obligation to defend NATO countries and the president's commitment to do that. And it looked like that might be what was happening. So,
and the Poles thought that's
and
what
the
was
Poles believed deeply that this was a Russian attack. So you were where?
I was in Bali, Indonesia, but not on vacation.
I
was in Bali, Indonesia with President Biden and his whole delegation for the G20 summit, alongside the leaders of our main NATO allies.
Which was quite fortuitous, actually.
And we also were on the eve of a summit with Xi Jinping.
So I tried to get Jake on the phone. It was well after midnight. He was understandably asleep. I could not reach him on his cell phone. So I, unfortunately for her, had to call someone on Jake's team, a good friend of ours named Ariana Berengout. and say to her, unfortunately, for you, Ariana, I need to ask you to walk into Jake's hotel room and like physically wake him up because something quite consequential has happened, and I think we need to huddle with the president and figure out what to do about it. So she did that. I got Jake on the phone. We talked about what had happened. We were clear that we didn't have all the information, but then we started to scramble to action. Jake was able to get the president and some of his Polish counterparts on the phone.
First thing I did was call my Polish counterpart immediately, basically to say, I'm going to get the president, I'm going to brief him, and then the president will get on the phone with your president, and we're going to work this through together. And in the meantime, let's continue to gather information. And he readily agreed to that. So I went, got the president's personal staff to go do the same thing, wake up the president. The president came out, and Secretary Blinken was also woken up. So the three of us, in the middle of the night in Bali, Indonesia, are sitting there back on the phone with you and the chairman and the Secretary of Defense and the leaders of our intelligence community, with the president basically saying, what the hell happened? Give me your best understanding, your best assessment of what happened.
And the message to the Poles, which was every bit as important, was take a beat, okay? Let us gather information and figure out what actually happened before we either go out and say something publicly that ends up being wrong or, God forbid, take an action based on false information. And thankfully, in this case, unlike the scenario portrayed in the film, because this was not Hollywood, it turned out that actually this was not a Russian attack on NATO territory, on Poland. This was a wayward Ukrainian defensive missile trying to take out or stop a Russian air attack on Ukraine that went off course, and just by sheer terrible, tragic luck, ended up killing 2 people in Poland. Now, that's a tragedy, but on another level, like, thank God this was not a Russian attack, because that would have meant a major escalation in the war.
So in the middle of the night, then the early morning hours, then over the course of the next several hours in Bali, the president engaged with the Polish president, engaged with the NATO Secretary General, got everybody on the same page, and then personally convened the NATO leaders who were there at the summit, and also countries beyond NATO, including Japan and others, basically so that everybody got a full briefing from the United States about what we thought happened, that had been coordinated closely with Poland, and that everybody could walk out and be on the same sheet of paper. All of that unfolded over the course of basically several hours, starting not too long after midnight Bali time, and was an example of how to have to execute in the face of this massive uncertainty. And in this movie, you've got the massive uncertainty of not knowing where this missile is coming from, or what the intention of whoever fired it is, or what's coming next. So one of the things in the movie is they try to fire 2 interceptors to knock it out. Again, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen the movie yet, go watch it. One of those interceptors just basically fizzles, and the other one misses.
Confirm impact. Confirm impact. Stand by, confirm.
Hold.
Come on, what are you waiting for?
It's negative.
Negative impact.
Object remains inbound.
And somewhere along the way, the Secretary of Defense, who, probably should have known this information in advance, says, hey, what are the chances these are going to hit? And someone tells him it's, 60%. And he says, oh, it's like hitting a bullet with a bullet. Now, of course, actually hitting a bullet with a bullet is like 1 in a million. So it's not quite like that. But what did you make of that scene?
Well, I guess a few things. And it's interesting, the U.S. Defense Department, now called the Department of War, has, I think, obviously been so concerned that people are going to be spooked by the idea that this missile gets through, evades our defenses, and they don't show it on the screen, but the prediction is that it's going to kill many, many millions of people in the United States. And so they put out a statement basically saying, incorrect portrayal, actually our record is much better than this. And I think it is true that under testing circumstances, which they try to make as realistic as possible. The Pentagon has a very good track record over the last decade or more of successfully shooting ballistic missiles out of the sky. That said, as we both, know from experience and have seen over time, you just never know until you're actually in that moment. So I think the portrayal is fair. I think the Pentagon is also correct that the odds are pretty good that an attempt to intercept that missile would be successful.
Yeah. And as you said, the experience of our missileers, the guys who man these Patriot batteries, THAAD batteries, and the testing experience that our guys up there in Alaska have had, the United States has gotten much, much better at this. And these guys are the best in the business. And so for a rogue missile, a one-shot, our ability to knock it down, I think, is pretty solid. Now, a barrage of missiles coming at the United States is a different situation. One of the other things I was really struck by in the movie was this scene.
We've already lost one American city today. How many more do you want to risk?
What kind of fucking question is that? This is insanity, okay?
No, sir. This is reality. 6 minutes to impact.
Because he's being pushed by the commander of Strategic Command to authorize a massive nuclear counterstrike, apparently against a bunch of different countries. Kind of cover your bases, because we're not sure who shot it, so we'll hit them all. I have to say, one thing about the movie that definitely left me a bit quizzical is the idea that if you don't know who fired this missile, you would just launch a nuclear attack against a bunch of potential culprits without further study of who actually it was, particularly in light of the fact that you've only had one missile fired so far. So this is not like a use it or lose it situation. But I don't know how that struck you.
Well, I think the president's reaction is actually quite rational and realistic in this situation. They do try to make it seem a little more justifiable by saying we're seeing concerning activities among our adversaries. But as they also point out, if our quote-unquote adversaries see that the United States is maybe about to be hit by a nuclear missile, because they also pay attention to missile launches and may be aware that this is unfolding, they might do unusual things not knowing how we're going to respond. So then we pick up their unusual activities and see that as menacing or threatening. And as you say in the movie, some of the people advising the president suggest that means he should attack them with U.S. nuclear weapons. And he, I think, quite rightly says that doesn't seem like the brightest idea to me. One interesting thing about the movie, by the way, in the definite spoiler category, is we don't know what the president ultimately decides. His final orders are not shown on the screen. By the way, Jake, did you happen to notice where the title of this movie comes from, as portrayed on screen?
I did. I think we both had the same reaction.
It's actually toward the end. The president is, I think, quite stressed, thinking about the scenario that he's been confronted with. And where does his mind go but to a podcast that he's recently heard, where he describes a guy, as he describes him, doesn't know the name, saying about a scenario maybe along these lines that, quote, we all built a house filled with dynamite and the walls are just ready to blow, but we kept living in it. And that's where this House of Dynamite title comes from. I just found it interesting, maybe given our current lives, which are possibly a lot less policy relevant than they were a year ago, that the President of the United States consumed a podcast, and it actually influenced his thinking on a significant topic.
Two podcast guys being able to possibly contribute to the president's decision-making in a crisis. So it seems like an omen.
Can't hope for more than that, and hopefully it bodes well for the long game.
That's it for this episode. We'll see you next week.